Virgin Most Powerful Radio, sharing the gospel with clarity and charity.
And now, Virgin Most Powerful Radio is pleased to present Hands-On Apologetics with renowned Catholic author and apologist, Gary Michuta.
And welcome, everybody, Hands-On Apologetics. You have entered into Virgin Most Powerful's Apologetics Dojo. It's great to be with you today, where we learn how to explain the faith with clarity, charity, and confidence, and basically getting you equipped to go out there and answer objections, clarify all those obstacles that impede evangelization. And it's wonderful to be with you. Got a great show in store for us today because we're going to have the man who started it all, the founder of Catholic Answers, and I believe certainly one of the key figures that kicked off the modern Catholic apologetic movement, Karl Keating, is going to be joining us. And if you've been listening to this show, you know that Karl comes on the show every month, and what we do is we pick a classic Catholic apologetics work that is probably on your shelf, maybe gathering dust, or maybe on the used bookstore shelf in your neighborhood. Which is unfortunate because these are gems that have been written in the past, and we need to keep them alive, keep them in front of us, be aware of them because they're great resources. So Karl's going to be coming on. We're going to talk about a work, I'm not sure how popular it is, but it's Halligan's The Sacraments and Their Celebration. So that's what we're going to talk about. Very interesting choice by Karl. Because strictly speaking, it's probably not a Catholic apologetic work. It's more of a work in basic theology. But nevertheless, as you know, Karl is the man when it comes to apologetics. And so he's going to dive into that and show why he believes this is a classic Catholic work that should be on the shelf of every apologist out there. And also, as always, we do our critical thinking skills exercises every episode. We look at a finding of the fallacy and informal fallacy. Today's informal fallacy is the argument from repetition. And also we meet an early church father. And, of course, the early church fathers are so important in apologetics because they are witnesses to the earliest faith, the earliest Christians. So the early church fathers are really the earliest Christian writings we have outside of the New Testament. And so today's early church father is a wondrous early church father because he is Gregory the Wonderworker, or otherwise known as Gregory the Miracle Worker. And so that's going to be super cool. We're going to learn a little bit about Gregory, going to sharpen our critical thinking skills, and then we're going to have one of the greats, Karl Keating, on the show. So lots of great stuff in store for us. And talk about great stuff, I want to welcome all of you watching live stream on Facebook, YouTube, all the other platforms we live stream on. Greetings, folks, from the Midwest Command Center. And also I want to welcome all of you listening on radio around the country and also via podcast around the world through either our handy-dandy phone app or our flagship website, which is virginmostpowerfulradio.org. Just go there, click on our shows, scroll down to Hands-On Apologetics or Jesus 911, Terry and Jesse. They're all up there. And bam, you have all access to all the programs. And as always, every show, I'm always encouraging you, don't let COVID become an excuse to not be salty, to make others thirst for Christ. But, the internet, social media has allowed us to evangelize using it. And that's one way you can do it that is free, simple, and quick, is just share the shows. Tell people about it. Had a great Jesus 911 right before the program. If you liked it, share it with your friends. Tell people about it. And also another way, too, is to smash the subscribe button on YouTube. Do thumbs up, likes, whatever, because that ultimately increases visibility, and it helps get the information into the homes of people who need to hear it. So thank you so much for all of you who have subscribed And I want to thank all of you in the near future who are about to subscribe. Smash that subscribe button, folks. Like, ring the bell, do all that stuff. We truly appreciate it. It helps with our mission as well. So, without further ado, why don't we jump to the Finding the Fallacy? Today's Finding the Fallacy is the argument from repetition. This is a wonderful fallacy because the name pretty much says it all. And, man, if you listen to enough debates, you know when this is happening because it happens a lot, where someone will just assert something and reassert it and reassert it and reassert it. And even if the opponent debunks it, knocks the stuffing out of the factual, whatever facts that it tried to rely on, the reassertion that happens again, as if nothing happened. You know, it's kind of it's kind of like the equivalent of the policeman saying, you know, move along, people, nothing happening here, when actually right above his shoulder, you know, behind him, you see all this stuff happening. And so it tries to give this kind of Jedi mind trick that if I keep asserting this as if it's a fact and don't interact with criticisms about it, people get the impression that the criticisms had no merit. And so this is very frequently used. It's just the argument from repetition over and over again. Keep asserting, and hopefully people won't notice that has been refuted numerous times. How do you refute it? Well, this one's tough because essentially you got to call them on the carpet. Call them out. Say, look, you keep saying the same thing over and over again. And you haven't interacted with any of the counter evidence or any of the arguments I brought up. So don't keep asserting something unless you're first going to defend it. That sometimes works. But, you know, like I said, this usually takes place in a formal setting, like a formal debate. Proof by assertion, if it happens when you're in one-to-one dialogue with someone, it may be that you're dealing with someone who simply is not being truthful or honest with you. In other words, they don't care about evidence. They don't care about whether what they're saying is true. They're just there to counteract, to contradict whatever you have to say. They're not listening. So I think it's a little different when you move from a formal setting in a debate to a one-on-one dialogue. Because if people keep bringing up the same thing, even though you may address it, they'll just repeat it again. Either that issue is not important and there's actually a more deeper fundamental issue that needs to be addressed, or the person's not being honest. They're just there to waste time. They're just there to, maybe if there's an audience, people listening, try to act like they've somehow shown that Catholicism doesn't have the legs to stand on. So again, you know, I think you need to, in charity, call them out, point it out. If you have the sense that there's a deeper issue, put the repetition aside and try to figure out, ask questions, find out what is that deeper issue that's preventing them from embracing the fullness of Christ and His church. So that could be a red flag issue. If someone keeps repeating something that's been corrected during the conversation, either they're not being honest or there's a deeper issue, and they're just throwing out objections to cover that deeper issue. All right, so that's our Finding the Fallacy for today, argument from repetition. Let's move on to Meet the Early Church Father, who is St. Gregory the Wonderworker. He was born sometime around AD 213, died around 270, 275. St. Gregory the Wonderworker, also known as the Miracle Worker, was born in wealthy pagan parents in Neo-Caesarea in the Pontus about the year 213. He was named Theodore and took the name Gregory when he was baptized. Together with his brother Athenador, Gregory went to Caesarea in Palestine in 233 AD to live with his sister, whose husband was imperial governor of Palestine. Remaining there for 5 years, he attended Origen's lectures and was converted to the faith. A few years later, he became consecrated the first bishop in his own native city, Neo-Caesarea, And he died there sometime between the years 270 275. Legends grew up around him, which give him the name or title Miracle Worker. And the great Cappadocian fathers of the 4th century, Basil and the other two Gregories, venerated him as the founder of the church in Cappadocia. So he's a very, very influential early church father. And like I said, many miracles are attributed to him. In terms of apologetics, he has a couple of major works. The first one's On the Creed, which he wrote sometime between 260 270. Gregory had the occasion to compose a short creed restricting it to the exposition of the Trinity. The text of it in the original Greek was incorporated into his biography of the Wonderworker written by St. Gregory of Nyssa, and is to be found also in a large number of manuscripts apart from the biography, extant also in Syriac, and 2 independent Latin copies, one by Rufinus, another early church father. The second work is known as the Canonical Letter, and is so called because of its inclusion in the corpus of canonical epistles of the Eastern Church. It appears to have been addressed to an unknown bishop who had consulted Gregory on various doubts and difficulties occasioned by the incursions of Bodari and the Goths into Pontus and Bithynia, which is in upper modern-day Turkey. Jurgen's Faith of the Early Fathers, which this segment's based on, notes that the authenticity of the 11th canon, cited below in this work, is disputed chiefly on the ground of it being unnecessary addition, somewhat to the manner of an explanation of the authentic canon 7, 8, and 9 of the same letter. Scholars debate this, but Jurgens feels that it perhaps is something of a spurious addition. And I hear the music coming up. Coming up next, we have Master Apologist Karl Keating. We're going to talk about Catholic apologetic classes. Stay tuned.
Leviticus 11:44 says, "Consecrate yourselves and be holy, because I am holy." St. Vincent Pallotti said, "You must be holy in the way God asks you to be holy." God does not ask you to be a Trappist monk or a hermit. He wants you to sanctify the world and your everyday life. May God show us the path to holiness and help us to follow it all the days of our life.
Did you know my mom's gonna have a baby?
She is? Will it be a boy? Or will it be a girl?
We don't know yet, but we heard the heartbeat and my dad said this is gonna be someone very special.
You mean like being a president? Or maybe a doctor?
Well, probably maybe like a singer or dancer, I think.
Hello, my name is Mary Ann Koharski. I'm the director of Pro-Life Across America. We know that every baby is a miracle and has the potential to do great things. If you know someone who is pregnant or in need of alternatives or assistance, or would like to support the work of Pro-Life Across America, please call 1-800-366-7773 or visit our website at prolifeacrossamerica.org. Pro-Life Across America is non-political and totally educational.
Pro-Life Across America, the Billboard people.
This is Terry Barber. I want to thank you for your support here at Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Here's an easy way to do it. If you're going to sell or buy a house, call Real Estate for Life, 877-543-3871, because they're going to get you a Christ-centered agent to purchase your home or to sell your home. And at the close of escrow, a portion of his commission goes right back to Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Call 877-543-3871. Thank you so much for your support.
Now, back to Hands-on Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody. Hands on Apologetics. And we're going to look at some Catholic classic works. You know, there's so many gems out there just sitting on the used bookshelves, stores, libraries that really they should be utilized by people today because they're just too good to be sitting there collecting dust. And today we're going to have Karl Keating. He's going to come out. We're going to talk about yet another great Catholic work. Karl is one of those guests that if I listed every accomplishment and every book he ever wrote, we wouldn't have time to interview him. So I'll just give you the short bio. He is the founder of Catholic Answers. And nowadays, he's a full-time author. He's written, so far, I think, over 16 books on such as Catholicism, Fundamentalism, Debating Catholicism series, Book for Life. He also writes in several genres, including religion, literature, outdoors, self-publishing, and so on. And you could keep abreast of all his great work at karlkeating.com. And Karl, welcome back to Hands on Apologetics.
Gary, it's good to be back with you, and we're going to be talking about another good book this time.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, this is an interesting book, Karl, because many of the other books we've looked at tied into your apologetics career in one form or another. But this one is not exactly a straightforward apologetic work.
No, it's not even one that I would classify as apologetics.
Yeah.
It's sacramental theology, really. The title is The Sacraments and Their Celebration. And the author was Nicholas Halligan, who was a Dominican priest. He died at the age of 80 in 1997. And this is one of several books he wrote. And as I mentioned in Book for Life, where I talked briefly about this book, it was important to me because it gave me a sense, not so much about each of the seven sacraments, but about when it was proper to administer them, what intention would be needed, who the proper minister was, and so on. Mm-hmm. And those points often came in useful in apologetics. But I don't recollect myself turning too often to Father Halligan's book when I had an overtly apologetical question. So it was more of kind of background information for me, put it that way.
Yeah, yeah. So why this book as opposed to, there's dozens of sacramental theology books out there. What was it that attracted you to this?
Well, of course, I came across it quite some years ago, so I honestly don't remember the initial attraction. But I found it a kind of schematic format that was useful for me. It sort of went away along with the way that I tend to think. I like to think in outlines and in subpoints and so forth. Mm-hmm. And, for each of the sacraments, Halligan would, divide the consideration into several parts, three mostly. The sacramental nature of that sacrament, how the sacrament's celebrated, and the minister of the sacrament. And those things will vary, of course, sacrament to sacrament. So I found this useful as a kind of refresher, but also for going into more depth on particular sacraments. So, for example, if I knew that I'd be conversing with somebody who might have some issue with baptism, I could go through Halligan fairly quickly and get some points to keep in mind that then might come up in our conversation.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. So it's a good summary, in other words, a nice compact summary to refresh your memory on all the different facets of the seven sacraments. Yeah,
but it's more than just a summary. That's an advantage. It was an advantage to me. But the book is about 250 pages, so it actually goes into the sacraments in a good amount of detail. So you can use it at both levels. If you need to capture a point or two about some sacrament, you can easily locate the discussion. And if the sacrament maybe is new to you in terms of theory, then you can read the whole chapter on that sacrament. And the chapter's going to be about 30 pages, on average. So there's enough there to get a handle on things without going into unnecessary depth. You can find books, for example, of 250 pages that are just on one sacrament. And they'll look at the whole history and examples through history and confusions about the sacrament and errors by this person or that person, whether Catholic or not Catholic. That can be overkill if you're needing just to get a good grasp of the sacrament to be discussing with somebody else. So that's where I find Halligan's book to be very useful. Of course, if I need more depth on something, I might turn to some other books in addition to Halligan. But I found this to be very useful, so it's been on my shelf now for 30 years at least, I guess.
Wow, yeah. And there are a few sacraments. The funny thing is, I think most people think back to the Baltimore Catechism days where it just seems like all the sacraments are very straightforward. But there are a few sacraments that are especially complex, and you could really go into the weeds, such as the Eucharist, marriage, even the sacrament of confession, penance.
Each of these have enough subtleties that even a lot of Catholics get confused.
Yeah.
So a good example would be marriage. I mean, are you really married? Did you meet the sacramental requirements? And the requirement does not include a church ceremony all dressed up fancy in white and for her and a tuxedo for him. Those are all accoutrements to it, but that's not the essence of the sacrament. What is the essence of the sacrament? Did I meet the requirements? Did both of us meet the requirements? And, there are cases where the answer has to be no. In fact, no matter what you thought you were doing, you didn't actually get a valid sacrament. Or in baptism. There have been reports in the news recently about priests who used the wrong sacramental formula innocently. I mean, because they were taught improperly at seminary, but they were using the wrong sacramental formula. So the baptisms they administered were not valid.
Yeah.
And now the diocese have been having to go back to all the families of children or adults baptized by these priests to let them know that they've got to come in and get conditionally baptized because there's a good chance that what they thought was a valid baptism wasn't, that the baptism never took, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah, I know in our diocese, we actually had a priest who was baptized with an invalid form of baptism, so that caused kind of a train wreck. Because it's required, you're required to be baptized in order to be ordained.
Yeah, I mean, you're not a Catholic until you're baptized. Yeah. So you don't get any of the sacraments until you're baptized. So I remember reading about that, and there was another case, I believe, of a priest elsewhere in the country fairly recently with a similar situation. So here you got the immensely awkward situation that every mass that priest celebrated was not valid, that his ordination was not valid, that his confessions that he heard were not valid. And in a way, no harm would have come from maybe the masses that he attempted to celebrate not being valid. I mean, people still got graces, although in those masses they would not have received the real Eucharist. Mm-hmm. But the people who attended were still, of course, Catholics in good standing, members of the church. But when you have a priest who's himself never baptized, so not really a priest technically, administering some of the sacraments, you've got a real problem, and as I say, right. The case that I brought up was one where there would be priests using the wrong formula for baptism, and so in that case, the baptisms weren't valid. As a side point, we'll maybe get to this later. You don't need to be a priest to do baptism. Anybody can perform a baptism. You don't even have to be a Christian. But you have to use the right formula, right? You have to have the right intention. Right. So these are the kinds of things that come into play. And by reading Halligan over the years, I was able to settle in my own mind some of the issues that would tend to come up. So I'd be alert to those as I'd be discussing either a particular person's situation with respect to a sacrament, or maybe with a non-Catholic who's just inquiring about sacraments in general.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, especially with tricky stuff like that, you can grab Halligan at least get a nice solid information on it, so you know the parameters and all the different aspects of each sacrament. Yeah. In fact, when that instance came up with the priest, one of my in-laws said, well, he had the baptism of desire. And again, I grabbed Ott for that one, but I could have grabbed Halligan. Maybe he as to whether baptism of desire is sufficient for ordination, which it isn't.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
I mean, it would be sufficient for salvation at the end of your life, but it's not something that, if you desire baptism, say when you're 20, and then you figure, oh, well, I've desired it, so therefore I'm baptized, therefore I'm a Catholic, therefore I can receive all the sacraments. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So this is a handy resource that you can appeal to when you get into the intricacies of each of the sacraments.
Yeah, I mean, for example, I've got the table of contents open to penance, and again, it's divided in this case into 4 categories. But under the second area, the celebration of the sacrament, he looks at individual absolution, general absolution, and the time and the place of the celebration of the sacrament. The third segment is on the minister of the sacrament, his jurisdiction, ordinary jurisdiction, delegated jurisdiction, the abuses that can happen in the confession, the seal of the confessional. What is that? Very important nowadays, especially since there are parts of the world, even in this country, that are trying to force priests to reveal what's told to them in the confessional. And then it goes on to the penitent. What's required of the penitent to receive the sacrament fully? Contrition, making the confession, and doing the penance, and so on. So what are the obligations of a penitent? And even as a little section at the end, on non-Catholic penitents. So you've got all these subcategories under the one sacrament. So if your question is, what about the seal of the confessional? Well, he's got three or four pages on that here. And so if you've got a question coming up about whether, I think it's in Australia, they passed a law that says that in criminal cases, priests have to come forward with what they've been told by the alleged criminal. And they have to come forward and say what he supposedly confessed in the confessional. Well, a Catholic priest can't do that, of course. But here you've got a civil legal problem and something to be addressed.
Yes, absolutely. We're chatting with Karl Keating on Halligan's sacraments and their celebration. More to come on the other side of the break. You're listening to Hands on Apologetics. Stay tuned, everyone.
A great man once said that evil is powerless if the good are unafraid. Well, you and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness. We're at war with the most dangerous enemy that has ever faced mankind in his long climb from the swamp to the stars. And it's been said if we lose this war, and in so doing lose this great way of freedom of ours, history will report with the greatest astonishment that those that had the most to lose did the least to prevent it from happening. Well, I think it's high time now that we ask ourselves if we still even know the freedoms that were intended for us by our founding fathers. Every generation of Americans needs to know that freedom exists, not to do what you like, but having the right to do what you ought. You weren't made to fit in, my brothers and sisters. You are born to stand out. Set yourself apart from this corrupt generation. Be saints. God bless you.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow, that's 80%. realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
This is Jesse Romero. You're listening to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda on Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
And welcome back, everybody. We're chatting with Karl Keating about a classic work, which is Halligan's The Sacraments and Their Celebration. And Karl, right before the break, you were going through his treatment, at least the broad points of his treatment on the Sacrament of Penance. And boy, there are so many different aspects that the seal of confession, that's a hot button topic now. And just interesting stuff about penitence, different kinds of penitence, what's incumbent upon people.
Yeah, each of the sacraments has requirements for valid administration and valid reception, and they vary from sacrament to sacrament. Some sacraments you don't need to have an explicit desire to receive the sacrament, such as baptism. No infant can have an explicit desire to have the sacrament because the infant's not remotely at the point of the use of reason yet, which normally comes around the age of 7 or so. So that explicit desire on the part of the recipient is not necessary for an infant to receive baptism. On the other hand, an explicit desire to receive the sacrament is necessary in something, say, like matrimony. Halligan has an interesting point here about the necessity for acquiescence to receiving the sacrament. He says the point here is not that an infant or insane person is going to be ordained, because you can actually be ordained without an infant. In theory, could be ordained, he points out. But of course, that never occurs. But in theory, it could happen. He says, but some sacraments take, even in the absence of a positive will. He said that. Let me find it here. In certain sacraments, the intention must be at least habitual and maybe implicit. But in others, it has to be very explicit. And that includes the sacrament of holy orders and matrimony and confecting the Eucharist, receiving the Eucharist. But he goes on to note that, you can't be married accidentally. You can't, in the sort of stereotypic old movie sense, you can't drag in a drunken sailor and get him married to some girl because his very drunkenness means that he can't explicitly consent to getting married. So one of the things that I comment in my book for Life is that it's some will be comforted to know that thus it is not possible to be married inadvertently. So you've got sacraments that require, an explicit intention to receive them, and then other cases not. Now you can receive, for example, the anointing of the sick without being aware of what's going on, without even being aware of that a priest is present administering that sacrament to you. So you don't need to have a kind of explicit, overt intention saying, yes, Father, I want to receive the sacrament of the anointing, because you might be out cold or in a coma or something. You could still be anointed. And as I said, you don't need that kind of explicit intention to be baptized as an infant, because an infant can't have such an explicit intention about anything. And yet the infant can receive that sacrament in confirmation and even the Eucharist, which is, of course, the customary arrangement in the Eastern churches, where the three sacraments, are given at the same time to the infant. So you've got, variances sacrament to sacrament. And these are things that had to be worked out by the church theologically and historically. It took some time, for in some of these cases to figure out what did our Lord mean when he was instituting this particular sacrament? Who's it for? Who's it by? Who can give it? And what are the requirements to give it and to receive it?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And that can be sometimes even today, people can contest, for example, the male priesthood. People will say, well, and people have said, I should say, that women could equally be ordained. And that comes down to a matter of, what is the proper recipient of that sacrament.
Yeah, now the church, of course, has definitively said that only a male, baptized male, can be ordained.
Right.
But you've got this modern example of the push for women's ordination is actually a kind of replication of confusions that occurred in different sacraments over the centuries when there'd be confusions about what would be going on within the sacrament. And a very good example of that, of course, is from the era of the Reformation, the beginning, well, a little after the beginning, actually, where it was alleged that the sacrament, which at this point the Reformers were calling more something like ordinances, but the sacrament did not actually effect a change in the bread and wine, but they were simply symbols of Christ, but they did not become his actual body and blood, although under different appearances, unbloody appearances. So you've got that confusion that was arising 500 years ago, roughly. Even though the initial reformers, I think both Calvin and Luther, accepted the traditional teaching, but that dissipated fairly quickly historically. So you've got, the three main strains of the Lutheran, the Reformed, and the Anglican, basically denying transubstantiation. So there's a basic understanding or misunderstanding of what a sacrament consisted of. And in that particular case, although the word transubstantiation as a word of art really was not used in the earliest centuries, it came toward the Middle Ages. Nevertheless, what it meant was believed in consistently until the Middle Ages, when we get the first instance of a writer denying the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. So you've got 1,000 years and more before this particular error crops up at all. And then several hundred years after that in the Reformation, in the break-off parts of Christendom, that error succeeds and takes place. It becomes the almost universal understanding of the Eucharist, which then for Protestants becomes symbolic and not real.
Right. Yeah, and also along with that was Luther reconfigured his understanding of ordination as well. That priestly ordination was it was more of an outgrowth of baptism rather than a separate sacrament.
Yeah, although of course, in those years, there was no one on the Protestant side who was suggesting that a woman could be ordained, even under the Protestant understanding of ordination. Right. That came much later.
That's kind of interesting, too.
Yeah, even in the 18th century, my favorite writer, Samuel Johnson, who's an Anglican, commented to, I think it was James Boswell, his biographer, about some woman preaching at a Protestant church, not the Anglican church, but it's kind of break-off sect. And Johnson said something like, a woman's preaching is like a dog standing on its hind legs. You're not so much surprised to see it done well as to see it done at all. and what Johnson was really meaning, well, he was not a theologian, was that women preachers were foreign to the essence of Christianity as he understood it. Well, all the more so for ordination, because, of course, back until a few decades ago, women, even in the Anglican Church, were not ordained. Okay, so the understanding, even within that church, for about 500 years, was that only men could be ordained. Okay, so even at the breakoff with Protestantism, a lot of certain sacraments were kept. I mean, parts of certain sacraments were kept in their understanding. So even though the Anglicans ended up having fairly early on invalid priestly orders, they nevertheless kept in mind certain things that were accurate about that sacrament, which is that only men could be ordained, for example. And so it's an interesting thing to look at, because you've got, in the case of Protestantism, sacramental errors that came up and prevailed for centuries and still prevail. And you've had other sacramental errors during the centuries that had come up at one point and then dissipated, and didn't seem to be such of a bother in later years.
Yeah, what would be an example of one of those?
Well, I think, for example, the status of baptism would be one. In the early years, there was some dispute about children being baptized, and that was fairly quickly resolved. And then it wasn't until the Reformation that you have a dispute within Protestantism. Some Protestants saying young children, infants, can be baptized. Others say, no, you have to wait until you're older and you accept Christ as your personal Lord and Savior. But we had a period of centuries where there was no dispute. This confusion about infants, yes or no, had come up briefly early on, but it got resolved quickly, and then there was not a problem for more than 1,000 years until you got this confusion again within only part of Protestantism, because part of it says infants can be baptized. For example, the Episcopal Church says that. But then you've got others say, no, infants cannot be baptized. And that would be, for example, the Baptist churches. Yeah. So it's interesting to see how sometimes an error will arise at one point regarding a sacrament and then disappear and will come back centuries later.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. We're chatting with Karl Keating about Catholic classic work. It's Halligan's Sacraments and their celebration. More to come on the other side of the break. You're listening to Hands On Apologetics.
Hi, this is Jesse Romero from the Terry and Jesse Show, also from Jesus 911. Let's face it, we all need to use the internet, but we need screen accountability. Why? Pornography is a huge problem, especially on the internet. And every time we tap into the internet, we get bombarded with images and temptations that degrade our humanity. So we need Covenant Eyes to block these pornographic sites and advertisements from infiltrating our lives. Covenant Eyes helps us take custody of our eyes and custody of our intellect. So I recommend you go to covenanteyes.com and type in the promo code VMPR to support the network. Protect yourself and your family from the imminent threats on the internet. www.covenanteyes.com, code VMPR, live porn free. Thank you for listening to Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Thank you. God bless you. Keep the faith.
If you shop on Amazon.com, there's an easy way to support Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Just visit smile.amazon.com and type in Catholic Resource Center under the desired charity. Now, when you log into your Amazon account and purchase products, a portion of it will automatically go to support Virgin Most Powerful Radio at no cost to you. Thanks in advance for supporting CRC and VMPR, and may God richly bless you and your family.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow, that's 80%. realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
Now, back to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody. We're chatting with Karl Keating, and we're talking about a Catholic classic. It's Halligan's Sacraments and their celebration. And Karl, I have a question for you. You're a veteran Catholic apologist. Of the 7 sacraments, which one do you think is the most thorny in terms of all the different particulars you have to keep in mind when addressing a question on that sacrament?
Well, that's a hard one to say. I would eliminate a few right away. I don't think baptism is particularly hard to talk about, even though the only question that really comes up is the infants to be baptized, yes or no. So that's pretty straightforward. And, of course, it's easy to explain how to perform the sacrament, who can perform it. The answer to the latter is that anybody. So that's confirmation rarely comes up. Anointing of the sick rarely comes up. So I would set those aside. The Eucharist gets a lot of discussion because the Catholic understanding of what the Eucharist is very far distinct from what so many, nearly all, Protestants imagine it to be. Okay? There are a few Anglicans and a few maybe High Church Lutherans who will have something similar to the Catholic understanding, even though in fact they don't have the valid Eucharist. But their understanding of it is similar to the Catholic position. But most Protestants see the Eucharist is merely symbolic. And so what they pass around is actually bread and wine or bread and grape juice, depending on which one where you're attending. So that one is quite distinct because, the Catholic position is this is the actual body and blood of Christ. The appearances are not, as one might suspect, they still look like bread and wine, but the fact is that's not what they are any longer. And so the discussion of that becomes a little difficult because moderns have difficulty talking about philosophy. And to talk about the Eucharist, you've got to be able to talk about philosophy in the sense of the difference between substance and accidents, that is, internal essence of something and the outward appearances of something. So it's a little more complex. So I would say that the Eucharist is probably the sacrament that gets the most confusion in terms of how the discussion goes forward and whether the person you're talking with, if you, the Catholic apologist, whether the person you're talking to is able to grasp what you're trying to say, because it takes more on your part to lay the groundwork to explain that sacrament than it would for some other sacrament.
Yeah, I totally agree, because there's a lot of background information you need to get a good grasp of what we teach. To my mind, for me, I always am afraid of marriage because not that I'm married and happily married. I know. I thought about that. No, but there's so many particulars like degrees of sanguinity and sacramental marriage versus a natural marriage, and there's lots of rules and regulations, I guess you can say, that go along with it. Although at its core, it's very simple.
Yeah, and that's true, especially in a day like ours, where Catholics and others are not very well instructed in what marriage is, and so they attempt to enter marriage with a very poor understanding of it, to the point where, as I said early on in the show, they might go through the outward ceremony at a church, but they might end up not actually being married. For example, if you try to enter the sacrament of matrimony, thinking, well, if it doesn't work out, we'll just divorce in a year and that'll be the end of it. If that's your attitude, you don't have the proper intention to get married, because part of the intention is the perpetuity of the sacrament of the marriage. So, once in, you're in and you're stuck, so to speak. So if you don't have that awareness and accept it, then you don't have the proper intention to get married, even though you have the proper intention to show up at the church and the reception and all that stuff. So you've got that kind of confusion nowadays, which wasn't so much a problem in years past, because just growing up, for example, Catholics pretty well knew that even though they realized there were Catholics of their acquaintance who got civil divorces, they also knew that those people still were married to each other, that kind of thing. Right. And also the Catholics in preparation maybe were better prepared. There are preparation classes today, of course, that one has to go through, but some of those are stronger or weaker than others. And so you will still get people entering into, or at least attempting to enter into the sacrament of matrimony without proper intention, without proper understanding what the sacrament really is about. And therefore the sacrament fails for them. It doesn't take. And
yeah, and especially with modern culture, it has so many deviant ways of viewing marriage. I mean, for example, the popular singer, or once popular singer, Smokey Robinson, when he was married, they were married as long as they both shall love, rather than for life. So eventually they fell out of love and got divorced. But really, he never had a valid marriage to begin with, if that was the intention.
That's correct. And so, with each of the sacraments, there's an intention involved on the part of the minister, in most of the cases on the part of the recipient. And each sacrament is a bit different from each of the others. So you've got to go through them one by one and not presume. One of the good things that the church teaches, and this is something that Halligan discusses right at the beginning of his book, he says, a sacramental celebration does not depend for its validity on the disposition of the minister. Its action has its effect from the power of Christ as the due sacramental action is performed. Ex opere operato. That is a Latin phrase which basically means the sacrament works of its own power. It does what it does, not because the minister, usually a priest, but in some cases, a non-priest, not because the minister has the right intention or the right degree of an intention. Mm-hmm. So the good thing is, when you're getting your sins forgiven in the confessional, it doesn't depend on whether the priest himself is holy, or whether the priest himself is paying attention to you in particular, whether the priest is able to perceive well what your particular spiritual problems are. When he gives you absolution, you're absolved, period. Okay. And that's coming through the power of the sacrament itself, and not because of the goodness or intelligence or attitude of the priest. And that's a big comfort, because we don't have to second guess. When we leave the confessional, we know our sins are forgiven. We can set them aside and ignore them. We don't have to go back and say, did I really get forgiveness from that priest? I found out that he drinks too much, or I find out that he speeds when he drives, or I found out that he did something improper in some other way. Does that mean that his absolution wasn't valid? No. None of those things affect the sacrament itself. They may be uncomplimentary about the priest, but they don't affect the validity of the sacrament. And so that's one of the important things that Halligan brings out in his book straight away, is that in most of the sacraments, the disposition of the priest as such doesn't make a difference.
Yeah, very important too. That gives us a sense of confidence, and that the sacrament's accomplished because it's Christ who accomplishes it. And it's interesting, the background of that really came from a reaction to sinful clergy. That was back in Augustine's day, wasn't it?
Go ahead and explain a little more what you mean by simple clergy.
Was it it's not Docetism, I always get this confused with another heresy. But basically, the sacraments are valid only in regards to those who are spiritually fit. So if you have a sinful minister, you wouldn't have the Eucharist. And so I think it was the Fifth Lateran Council who declared that, the sacraments are valid. Yeah, go ahead.
Right. Well, think of the situation. You go to Mass, and the priest seems to say everything properly according to the rubrics. And yet, if the validity of the sacrament, that is, whether Christ really is made present there, depends on the priest's holiness, how could you ever know whether the sacrament is valid? Because you don't know his heart. You don't know whether he's in a state of grace or not. You have no way to know. He could seem to be a Padre Pio or a Curé de Ars, but you still have to say, for all I know, he could be in a state of mortal sin as he's celebrating Mass.
Right.
And does that mean that the Mass then is invalid? And the answer is no. Okay. It doesn't depend on the holiness of the priest. It does depend that he does, he says the right words and all those kinds of things, that he has the matter and form of the sacrament, that he's using actual wheaten bread, not rye bread, that he's using actual wine and not grape juice or soda pop. Okay. So those kinds of things have to be there, the matter and form. He's got to be able to say, as St. Thomas Aquinas said, the Mass can be valid if the priest says 8 words. This is my body, this is my blood. So, the priest has to have the right materials, the matter. He has to use the right form, that is the words or other actions. But so long as he does those things for the sacraments, it doesn't matter what kind of man he is, at least not in terms of the validity of the sacraments. Of course, it matters in different ways what kind of man he is. But the validity of the sacrament doesn't depend on him being a saint versus a scoundrel. Okay, and that's a great advantage to us, because then we can leave Mass saying, I've got the real sacrament here. And you can have confidence in that.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, Karl, we're coming up to the end of the program. Real quick, any books in the works?
Nothing close enough to be worth bringing up at this point, because I have some in the works. They may, 1 or 2 might not reach fruition, and I would hesitate to announce working on a book that never shows up.
Sure.
So,
that's understandable. Yeah, very good. Where can people go to get a hold of all your awesome books?
Well, the easiest way is Amazon. Search on my name, and it'll all pop up.
All right, very good. Well, thank you, Karl. Appreciate it. Great discussion.
Gary, it's good to be with you again. Take care.
Okay, you too. That's Karl Keating, ladies and gentlemen. And also check out his website, karlkeating.com. Great books. Get a hold of anything Karl writes. It's all gold. And, man, it's time to shut down the Midwest Command Center here, turn out the dojo lights. Thank you so much for listening, everybody. And God willing, we'll be back again tomorrow to do this thing we call Hands-On Apologetics. By the way, coming up next, High Impact Catholic Talk coming at you with Terry and Justin. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
In the 1990s, I lived and worked in Hollywood. But when my wife Betty's mom took ill, we relocated to Orange County. And it was during this time in our lives that I converted to Catholicism. Once my eyes were opened to the truth, I couldn't learn enough about the faith. But I had less free time than ever, especially with a long commute. That's when I discovered the real value of Catholic audio. Listening to cassette tapes transformed my daily commute into a miniature retreat. And that's the beauty of Virgin Most Powerful Radio today. Since the podcasts are archived, you can listen anytime on our smartphone app. I know how listening to Catholic audio can bring you closer to Christ and His Church, so I encourage you to visit the App Store or go to vmpr.org and download the app today. It just might change your life. I'm Matthew Arnold for Virgin Most Powerful Radio.